The summer sun beat down on Willow Creek, baking the manicured lawns and making the asphalt shimmer. But inside the sanctuary of Eleanor Vance's backyard, a different world existed. Here, the heat was tempered by the whisper of the breeze through the weeping willow, and the air hummed with the gentle filter of her in-ground pool. It wasn't just a pool, it was the cobalt heart of her home, a legacy from her late husband, Mark. Every tile laid, every pipeline buried, had been a joint effort, a testament to their shared dream of a peaceful retirement splashing with grandchildren. The laughter of those phantom children still echoed in the sun-drenched silence. Eleanor, a woman in her late 60s with a spirit far younger than her years, and a will forged in the quiet resilience of a life lived fully, was trimming her prize-winning roses near the back fence when the cacophony began. It wasn't a distant thrum of construction, but an immediate, ear-splitting grind that seemed to vibrate through the very earth beneath her feet. She straightened, secateurs dangling forgotten in her hand, her eyes darting towards the source of the noise. Over the top of the newly erected temporary chain-link fence that now partitioned her property from the vacant lot next door, a lot, recently acquired by the ominous-sounding Pinnacle Development Group, a monstrous yellow machine, a glorified dump truck with a massive articulated arm, was rising. Its engine groaned, a mechanical beast awakening, and then with a sickening lurch, its bucket tipped. Eleanor's breath hitched. She watched, paralyzed, as a dark, coarse cascade erupted from the bucket. It wasn't dirt. It wasn't debris. It was coarse, gray gravel, and it was falling inexorably directly into the glistening expanse of her pool. The first few stones hit with a hollow plunk, sending ripples across the surface. Then came a deluge, a roar of concrete and rock, each impact a dull, brutal thud against the water. The pristine blue shattered, replaced by an ugly churning mass of dark stone and displaced water, bubbling and frothing. It was like watching a living thing die, suffocated by an unnatural blight. "Stop!" Eleanor's voice tore from her throat, a guttural shriek that felt alien even to her own ears. She dropped the secateurs and stumbled forward, pushing through the rose bushes, thorns snagging her cardigan. "What are you doing? Stop it, you hear me?" The driver, a burly man with a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes, paused the dumping mechanism. He peered down from his elevated cab, a scowl on his face that quickly morphed into a detached, almost bored expression. He motioned to someone off camera, then slowly, deliberately, began to raise the bucket once more, poised for another destructive pour. "No!" Eleanor scrambled to the flimsy chain-link fence, grabbing the cold metal. "Get out of my yard! You can't do this!" Another figure emerged from behind the dump truck, a man in a crisp suit, his tie perfectly knotted despite the heat. He was sleek, with sharp features and eyes that seemed to constantly calculate. Julian Thorne. Eleanor knew from the brief frosty encounter they'd had a week ago when he had come to inform her of Pinnacle Development's plans for the adjacent lot. He carried a clipboard like a shield. "Mrs. Vance," Thorne's voice was smooth, annoyingly calm, cutting through the raw edges of her panic. He barely raised it over the rumbling idle of the truck. "As per the notice delivered to your residence last Thursday, this property has been deemed an immediate hazard." "Hazard?" Eleanor scoffed, pointing a trembling finger at her drowning pool. "My pool? It's perfectly safe. I had it professionally inspected last month." Thorne took a step closer to the fence, his gaze sweeping over the desecrated pool with an air of clinical assessment, as if it were a contaminated waste site, not a place of joy and memory. "Indeed, but the inspection was conducted prior to our engineers discovering significant subterranean structural vulnerabilities originating from this very location." He tapped the clipboard, producing a single sheet of paper. "We have the official documentation here, signed and sealed by the city's Public Safety and Zoning Department." Eleanor stared at the paper, her mind reeling. Subterranean structural vulnerabilities? It was an absurd claim. Her house, built on solid bedrock, had stood for decades without a single foundation crack. Her pool, state-of-the-art for its time, was a self-contained unit, designed to withstand far more than the gentle vibrations of a neighbor's lawnmower, let alone any imaginary vulnerability. "This is a lie!" she spat, her voice cracking with fury and disbelief. "You're making this up! You can't just come onto my property and destroy my personal property based on some fabricated report?" Thorne's smile was thin, devoid of humor. "On the contrary, Mrs. Vance, we have obtained an emergency court order due to the immediate and pressing danger this presents to our ongoing development." He gestured vaguely towards the empty lot, where only a few survey stakes marked the ground. "Any instability in the adjacent land could compromise our foundation work. This measure is simply to stabilize the area, for your own safety, of course." The last words dripped with an infuriating condescension. Eleanor felt a surge of cold dread mingle with her rage. An emergency court order? They had gone through the courts without her knowledge. How could that be possible? She hadn't received any summons, any notification beyond the vague informational notice Thorne had mentioned, which she'd tossed into her junk mail pile, dismissing it as corporate boilerplate. "You never informed me of any court date." "I haven't." "Been served!" she cried, her voice rising. "Our legal department ensured proper notification was attempted, Mrs. Vance," Thorne said, his eyes now fixed on his watch. "The notice was delivered to your mailbox last week. It clearly stated our intent to secure an emergency injunction if discussions regarding the stability of your property could not commence. Given your lack of response, we had no choice but to proceed." Lack of response? I never even knew there were discussions. Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face. They had played her. They had sent a cryptic notice, knowing she would overlook it, then used her supposed non-response as justification for this outrageous act. The dump truck's engine roared again, a final deafening crescendo as the last of the gravel poured out, hitting the now submerged surface with a dull splash. The driver gave a satisfied grunt and began to retract the arm. The blue was gone, replaced by a gray, stony wasteland. The water, a murky brown, churned sluggishly beneath the weight of the rocks. It was a grave. Her pool, her sanctuary, was buried. Eleanor stood, rooted to the spot, staring at the monstrous desecration. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. Tears stung her eyes, hot and angry, but she refused to let them fall. Not in front of this man. Thorne adjusted his tie, a flicker of something that might have been triumph in his cold eyes. "The gravel will remain until proper remediation can be executed. We'll be in touch regarding the next steps." He turned to the truck driver. "All right, clear out. We've got a schedule to keep." The dump truck rumbled to life, slowly backing away, leaving behind a trail of tire marks on the grass and the horrifying mound of gravel. The excavator arm swung back into place, a monstrous appendage that had just committed an act of unspeakable vandalism. Eleanor watched it go, her hands still gripping the fence, her knuckles white. She looked at Thorne, his back already turning, as he walked towards a sleek black SUV parked at the curb. "You haven't heard the last of this, Mr. Thorne," she yelled, her voice raw, trembling with a fury that felt both overwhelming and utterly impotent. "You hear me? You haven't heard the last of this." Thorne didn't even pause. He simply raised a hand, a dismissive wave, and slipped into the back of the SUV. The car pulled away smoothly, leaving Eleanor alone amidst the oppressive silence, broken only by the distant hum of traffic and the overwhelming, crushing presence of the gravel in her pool. She stumbled back, away from the fence, her legs feeling like lead. She collapsed onto a damp patch of grass near her rose bushes, still clutching the secateurs, though she couldn't remember picking them up again. Her gaze was locked on the gravel pit that had once been her vibrant, life-giving pool. The water was now completely obscured, the entire basin filled to the brim with rough, jagged stones. It looked like a construction site, a gaping wound in the heart of her meticulously kept garden. This wasn't just about a pool. This was an invasion. Deliberate, calculated act of aggression. They hadn't just filled her pool, they had thrown down a gauntlet. And in that moment, as the initial shock gave way to a burning, righteous indignation, Eleanor knew one thing with absolute certainty. She would not back down. They had underestimated her. They had mistaken her quiet life for weakness. And they were about to learn a very painful, very public lesson. The sun, once a benevolent presence, now felt like a spotlight illuminating her ruin. A single furious tear finally escaped, tracing a path down her cheek. It wasn't a tear of defeat, but of a resolve hardening like steel. She stood up, her jaw set. She had to fight. For Mark, for her home, for everything they had built. This wasn't just gravel in a pool, it was a declaration of war. And Eleanor Vance, though a widow of modest means, was about to become a formidable adversary. The game had just begun, and the first shot, a brutal, cowardly one, had been fired directly at her sanctuary. She would respond, and her response would be devastating. Eleanor spent the rest of that afternoon in a haze, the acrid smell of fresh asphalt from the new development next door mingling with the damp scent of the desecrated pool. Her initial fury had cooled into a hard, brittle resolve. She couldn't just stand there and watch her life's work, her memories, be swallowed by a corporate behemoth. The first thing she did was call her son, Michael. Michael, a sharp but perpetually harried real estate lawyer in the city, answered on the third ring, his voice tight with the stress of another long day. "Mom, everything okay? You sound breathless." Michael. "They did it," Eleanor choked out, the words catching in her throat. "Pinnacle Development. They dumped gravel into my pool. They filled it. Said it was an immediate hazard and they had a court order." A pause stretched on the line, punctuated by the faint sounds of city traffic. "What? Mom, that's insane. A court order? Without proper notice?" Michael's voice, usually calm and measured, was now laced with disbelief. "They claimed they sent a notice, buried it in junk mail, I suppose. Said my lack of response meant they could just proceed." Eleanor recounted Thorne's smug explanation, the details burning themselves into her memory. "Michael, you have to help me. This is outrageous. This is an act of war." Michael arrived within the hour, his usually immaculate suit rumpled, his tie askew. He took one look at the gray, stony expanse that had been his childhood swimming hole, and his jaw tightened. "Unbelievable," he muttered, running a hand through his dark hair. "This is beyond aggressive. This is outright hostile." Walked the perimeter of the buried pool, pulling out his phone, snapping pictures from every angle. He peered at the flimsy chain-link fence, then at the empty lot beyond. "An emergency injunction, huh? Without proper service, that's a massive procedural violation. And the claim of subterranean structural vulnerabilities sounds like a textbook scare tactic." "So what do we do?" Eleanor asked, her voice steady now, buoyed by Michael's presence. "First, we go straight to the city's public safety and zoning department. We get a copy of that official documentation Thorne mentioned. Then we find out exactly what kind of emergency court order they cooked up and how they managed to get it without notifying you properly." Michael's eyes, usually tired, now held a glint of determination. "This is dirty, Mom. Really dirty." The next morning was a whirlwind of phone calls and frustrated bureaucracy. Michael, armed with his legal credentials and Eleanor's unwavering resolve, managed to secure an emergency meeting with a mid-level official at the Public Safety and Zoning Department, a harried woman named Ms. Henderson. "Ah, the Vance property," Ms. Henderson said, without looking up from her computer screen. "Yes, we received a rather urgent request from Pinnacle Development last week regarding significant geological instability emanating from your property. A Class A hazard, I believe." "A Class A hazard?" Eleanor exclaimed, aghast. "My property has never had any geological instability. My house is on solid ground." Michael leaned forward, his voice calm but firm. "Ms. Henderson, we'd like to see the report that led to this classification and the corresponding emergency injunction. My mother was never properly served any notice of these proceedings." Ms. Henderson typed for a moment, then frowned. "It seems—" The geological survey report was submitted directly to our office, along with a sworn affidavit from Pinnacle's lead engineer, Dr. Elias Thorne. Eleanor's blood ran cold. Elias Thorne. Julian Thorne had mentioned Dr. Elias Thorne, a relative. Perhaps a brother? It seemed too convenient. Ms. Henderson printed out a document. "And here's the emergency order. It was granted ex parte, meaning without the other party present, based on the perceived immediate threat to public safety and the significant economic impact of delaying the developer's project." She handed the papers across the desk. "Normally, we'd require extensive outreach, but the nature of the alleged threat was deemed severe." Eleanor snatched the geological report. It was thick, filled with scientific jargon and diagrams, culminating in a stark red stamp declaring her property the source of imminent catastrophic land subsidence. The signature at the bottom? Dr. Elias Thorne. "This is falsified," Michael stated flatly, examining the document. "Look at the methodology. It's filled with assumptions, not actual data points from the Vance property. And this court order, it's legitimate technically, but obtained under highly questionable circumstances, bordering on fraud." "So what now?" Eleanor asked, her voice barely a whisper. The weight of the system, the sheer brazenness of their actions, was starting to feel oppressive. "Now," Michael said, "we get our own independent geological survey, and we prepare a motion to vacate this emergency order. We sue the mom. We sue Pinnacle Development for trespass, vandalism, and fraudulent misrepresentation. We also file a formal complaint against Dr. Elias Thorne with the State Engineering Board." The word sue hung in the air, heavy with unspoken implications of time, money, and emotional toll. Eleanor had always avoided conflict, preferred peace. But looking at the official-looking, yet clearly fraudulent documents in her hand, the memory of Thorne's smirk, and the image of her beautiful pool choked with gravel, she knew there was no other choice. Their independent geologist, a grizzled, no-nonsense woman named Dr. Lena Hansen, arrived 2 days later. She spent hours meticulously examining Eleanor's backyard, drilling core samples and running seismic tests. Her face grew increasingly grim as she worked. "Mrs. Vance," Dr. Hansen said finally, wiping sweat from her brow, "there's absolutely no evidence of any subterranean structural vulnerabilities originating from your property. Your land is remarkably stable. In fact, it's sitting on a solid limestone shelf, one of the most stable geological formations in this region. This report from Dr. Elias Thorne is, well, it's a work of fiction, frankly. It appears to have been fabricated to justify a predetermined outcome." Eleanor felt a surge of vindication, followed by a deeper surge of anger. "So they just made it all up?" "Every bit of it," Dr. Hansen confirmed. "The data points cited in their report don't even correspond to the coordinates of your pool. It's like they used a template and just plugged in some scary-sounding terms." She paused, then added, "You know, Dr. Elias Thorne has quite a reputation. He's often the expert witness for large development groups, always finds exactly what they need him to find." The discovery solidified Eleanor's resolve. This wasn't just a misjudgment. It was a deliberate, malicious act. Michael, armed with Dr. Hansen's unimpeachable report, immediately filed the motion to vacate the emergency injunction and initiated the lawsuit. The legal papers landed on Julian Thorne's desk with a resounding thud. Pinnacle Development's response was swift and expected. They filed a counter-motion, asserting the validity of their original findings and accusing Eleanor of attempting to obstruct a vital public development project. Their lawyers, a formidable team from a prominent city firm, launched a media blitz, painting Eleanor as an emotional homeowner clinging to outdated property values, single-handedly holding back progress. Local news channels picked up the story, showing footage of Eleanor's gravel-filled pool alongside slick renderings of the modern high-rise luxury apartments Pinnacle planned to build. "Mrs. Vance's claims are baseless," Julian Thorne declared in a televised interview, his voice oozing sincerity. "We acted purely out of concern for public safety. Her property poses a demonstrable risk, and we regret that she has chosen to pursue frivolous litigation rather than cooperate for the good of the community." Eleanor watched the broadcast from her living room, her jaw clenched. The community. They only cared about their bottom line. But a seed of an idea began to sprout in her mind. If they were going to play dirty with public opinion, maybe she could, too. The first hearing for the motion to vacate was set for 2 weeks later. Michael worked tirelessly, preparing his arguments, gathering evidence. Eleanor, meanwhile, started making calls to her neighbors, many of whom had lived in Willow Creek for decades, just like her, to the local historical society with whom she volunteered, to the small-town newspaper, the Willow Creek Gazette, known for its stubborn independence. She told them her story, calmly, factually, but with an undercurrent of righteous indignation that resonated. She didn't exaggerate. The sight of her ruined pool spoke for itself, and she mentioned Dr. Elias Thorne and his questionable track record. The day of the hearing arrived, tense and stifling. The courtroom was small, stuffy, filled with the hushed murmurs of lawyers and the occasional click of a camera from a local news reporter. Eleanor sat beside Michael, her spine straight, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Across the aisle sat Julian Thorne and Pinnacle's legal team, radiating confidence. The judge, a stern, gray-haired woman named Judge Albright, listened impassively as Michael presented Dr. Hansen's report, painstakingly refuting every claim made by Dr. Elias Thorne. He emphasized the lack of proper service, the ex parte nature of the original order, and the malicious intent behind the gravel dumping. Then it was Pinnacle's turn. Their lead counsel, a sharp-suited man named Mr. Davies, confidently presented Dr. Elias Thorne's original report again, arguing its legitimacy and the severe and imminent danger Eleanor's property supposedly posed. He painted Eleanor as a recalcitrant, uncooperative individual determined to impede progress. The gavel's sharp crack echoed in Julian Thorne's ears long after Judge Albright's pronouncement. His meticulously crafted plan had not just unraveled, it had exploded in his face, sending shrapnel of criminal investigations and high-profile lawsuits flying. The smug confidence he wore like a second skin had evaporated, replaced by a cold, reptilian fear. This wasn't just a setback. It was a potentially catastrophic blow to Pinnacle Development's reputation, and more critically, to his own career. Back at Pinnacle's gleaming corporate headquarters, the mood was glacial. The executive board, usually a bastion of detached power, was in an uproar. Julian, pale and tight-lipped, faced a barrage of questions he couldn't adequately answer. The referral to the district attorney's office for investigation into Dr. Elias Thorne's fraudulent testimony and, by extension, Pinnacle's conduct, was a scarlet letter on their pristine corporate image. "Explain this, Julian," barked Mr. Sterling, the chairman, his voice a low growl. "How did a simple property acquisition escalate into a criminal inquiry and a public relations nightmare? We have investors calling, demanding answers." Julian stammered. "The geological report. It was provided by Dr. Thorne. He assured us it was ironclad. We followed standard procedure for an ex parte order given the urgency of the site prep." "Standard procedure, Julian?" interjected Ms. Albright, no relation to the judge. The company's head of legal, her voice sharper than any blade. "You relied on a report that couldn't even stand up to basic scrutiny? We're now facing charges of vandalism and fraud. Do you understand the implications of that?" The internal pressure on Julian Thorne became immense. He was ordered to contain the damage, to make Eleanor Vance go away, and to make it happen fast. Pinnacle's lawyers, now acutely aware of the judge's scrutiny and the DA's potential involvement, shifted their strategy. The media blitz painting Eleanor as a nuisance quickly dissolved. The new directive was to silence her, not just legally, but financially. Meanwhile, in Willow Creek, Eleanor Vance had become an unlikely local hero. The Willow Creek Gazette, initially cautious, had seized upon the judge's scathing ruling. Their front-page headline screamed, "Widow wins round 1. Against corporate giant, fraudulent report exposed." The article detailed Dr. Elias Thorne's crumbled testimony and Judge Albright's referral to the DA neighbors. Eleanor had quietly rallied, now came forward openly. Mrs. Peterson, whose prize-winning petunias always bordered Eleanor's roses, brought over a casserole. Mr. Rodriguez, who ran the local hardware store, offered to lend tools for any cleanup she might need. The Historical Society, incensed by Pinnacle's disregard for local concerns, organized a small impromptu Support Eleanor Vance gathering at the town square. At the gathering, Eleanor, standing slightly nervously but with newfound steel, addressed the small crowd. "They tried to bully me," she said, her voice clear despite the tremor in her hands. "They thought I was just an old woman who would roll over, but this isn't just about my pool. It's about our homes, our community. It's about standing up to corporate greed that thinks it can just trample over ordinary people." Her words resonated. The story of the gravel-filled pool, a tangible symbol of corporate arrogance, galvanized Willow Creek. Online forums buzzed with outrage. Petitions against Pinnacle Development's project, demanding stricter oversight, began circulating. The narrative had shifted. Eleanor Vance was no longer just a homeowner. She was the face of resistance against a powerful, unscrupulous developer. Michael, emboldened by their initial victory and the wave of public support, felt the shift as well. He prepared for the next phase of the lawsuit, the discovery process. This was where they would unearth Pinnacle's internal communications, financial records, and every email exchange related to the Willow Creek project. He knew the truth. About Dr. Elias Thorne's report was just the tip of the iceberg. There had to be directives, internal pressures, perhaps even illicit incentives that led to such a brazen fabrication. Pinnacle's legal team, however, responded with a tactic Eleanor and Michael hadn't fully anticipated: attrition. They flooded Michael with endless, convoluted legal motions, requests for obscure documents, and postponements. Every small step forward was met with 3 steps back into a morass of paperwork and procedural delays. The goal was clear: exhaust their resources, financially and emotionally. "They're trying to bleed us dry, Mom," Michael admitted one evening, his face etched with exhaustion, surrounded by stacks of legal binders in Eleanor's dining room. "Every motion, every response, it costs money, and they have bottomless pockets." Eleanor nodded, her gaze fixed on the empty space where her pool once shimmered. The gravel remained, a constant, ugly reminder. "We knew it wouldn't be easy, Michael, but we won the first round. We just need to keep chipping away at them." Despite her brave words, the financial strain was beginning to tell. Michael was dedicating almost all his time to her case, neglecting his other clients. The fees for Dr. Hansen's comprehensive report, though necessary, were substantial. Eleanor had dipped into her modest savings intended for unforeseen emergencies or perhaps one day for the grandchildren Mark had dreamed of. The quiet anxiety about money, a specter she'd largely managed to keep at bay since Mark's death, began to creep back. One afternoon, a surprising visitor arrived at Eleanor's door, Ms. Peterson, her neighbor, accompanied by a woman, Eleanor. vaguely recognized from the Historical Society, Ms. Anya Sharma. "Eleanor," Ms. Peterson began, her voice gentle. "We've been talking. We know legal battles like this cost a fortune, and you're fighting for all of us. We've started a community fund," Ms. Sharma explained, holding out a small, unassuming envelope. "Donations are coming in from neighbors, local businesses, even people from other towns who heard about what Pinnacle did. It's not much yet, but it's a start." Eleanor stared at the envelope, her eyes welling up. The gesture was small, but the sentiment behind it was enormous. It was a tangible sign that she wasn't alone, that her fight was truly their fight. She opened the envelope. Inside were a few crisp bills and a handful of handwritten notes. "For justice, Eleanor. Don't give up. We're with you." The financial assistance, though modest compared to Pinnacle's war chest, was a lifeline, a moral booster that rekindled her spirit. It reinforced the idea that this was no longer just her personal vendetta, but a collective stand. Then, a bombshell dropped. Michael received a sealed envelope. Hand-delivered by a private investigator Eleanor and Michael had hired on a shoestring budget to quietly dig into Dr. Elias Thorne's past. The investigator, a grizzled ex-cop named Frank Miller, had an uncanny knack for unearthing buried secrets. "I found something," Frank's voice crackled over the phone, "about our good doctor. Seems he's not quite as independent as he claims to be. Remember that reputation Dr. Hansen mentioned? Turns out, it's not just about finding what developers need him to find, it's about how he's incentivized." The envelope contained a series of financial transactions, blurred but legible bank statements, and a detailed summary of several shell corporations. It meticulously laid out a pattern. Dr. Elias Thorne, through a labyrinthine network of offshore accounts and dummy companies, was receiving substantial consulting fees from a holding company, Granite Holdings. And a deeper dive revealed that Granite Holdings was a wholly owned subsidiary of Pinnacle Development. Dr. Elias Thorne wasn't just an independent expert working for Pinnacle. He was on Pinnacle's payroll, a de facto employee, funneling money through layers of obfuscation to hide the direct conflict of interest. His entire independent geological firm was a front, designed to give a veneer of legitimacy to fraudulent reports that directly benefited his secret employer. Michael's eyes widened as he scanned the documents. "Mom," he breathed, the implications sinking in. "This changes everything. This isn't just a fraudulent report. It's a conspiracy to commit fraud. Elias Thorne is effectively a salaried employee of Pinnacle, running a sham consulting firm to create these bogus reports for them. This isn't just about your pool anymore. This is about systematic, deliberate deception." Eleanor felt a cold, righteous anger spread through her. "They thought they were so clever, didn't they?" "They were," Michael said, a grim satisfaction in his voice. "Until Frank started digging. This is the smoking gun, Mom. This exposes their entire operation." The revelation of Dr. Elias Thorne's direct, concealed financial ties to Pinnacle Development wasn't just evidence for their civil lawsuit. It solidified the criminal case the district attorney's office was building. It turned Julian Thorne's initial miscalculation into a far more serious criminal conspiracy. The irony was devastating. In trying to bury Eleanor's pool, Pinnacle had buried themselves under a mountain of their own deceit. The powerful beat came when Michael, armed with this explosive new evidence, immediately filed an amended complaint, adding charges of organized fraud and racketeering. The legal landscape shifted dramatically. This wasn't just a homeowner versus a developer anymore. This was a state prosecutor, backed by incontrovertible evidence, going after a powerful corporation. Julian Thorne, who had orchestrated the initial act of vandalism, was about to realize that his carefully constructed house of cards was finally collapsing, piece by agonizing piece. The true depths of Pinnacle's corruption. The bombshell revelation of Dr. Elias Thorne's clandestine ties to Pinnacle Development hit Julian Thorne like a physical blow. The moment Michael filed the amended complaint, Julian knew the game had changed from a messy civil dispute to a federal matter. Organized fraud and racketeering. These were not charges a powerful corporation could sweep under the rug with high-priced lawyers and public relations spin. This was a direct threat to the very existence of Pinnacle Development and to Julian's freedom. The executive board, once merely agitated, was now openly hostile. Mr. Sterling, the chairman, had called an emergency closed-door meeting excluding Julian entirely. When Julian finally gained access to the hushed, tense boardroom, the air crackled with accusations and veiled threats. "Julian," Mr. Sterling's voice was dangerously calm, "the district attorney's office has issued subpoenas for nearly every senior executive involved in the Willow Creek project, including yourself. They're asking for years of financial records, internal communications, everything related to Dr. Elias Thorne's consulting firm. This goes beyond a PR nightmare. This is a potential corporate dismantling." Julian swallowed, his throat suddenly dry. "I acted on the information provided to me. Elias Thorne assured me." "Elias Thorne is a puppet, Julian." Ms. Albright, the head of legal, snapped, her face etched with a fury that bordered on fear. "And you were the one pulling the strings. We have an ethical and legal obligation to distance ourselves from this immediately. The board has voted. Effective immediately, you are relieved of all duties regarding the Willow Creek project. Furthermore, your position as Senior Vice President of Acquisitions is under review. You are to cooperate fully with the ongoing investigation, but any public statement must be cleared through legal." Julian Thorne felt the floor drop out from under him, sidelined, stripped of authority. It was a thinly veiled attempt to throw him under the bus, to make him the scapegoat. The board would sacrifice him to save the company, and he knew it. A cold fury, far more potent than his earlier fear, began to simmer within him. He had built this. He had orchestrated the intricate acquisitions that had made Pinnacle a titan. He wouldn't go down alone. The district attorney's office, under the leadership of the formidable chief prosecutor Sarah Jensen, wasted no time. Subpoenas flew like hungry vultures, landing on desks across Pinnacle's empire. Forensic accountants swarmed, meticulously tracing the intricate web of shell companies and offshore accounts that funneled payments to Elias Thorne. News channels, now smelling blood in the water, descended on Willow Creek. Eleanor's quiet, tree-lined street was transformed into a media circus. Reporters camped outside her house, eager for a soundbite from the widow who took on Goliath. Eleanor, despite the whirlwind, remained remarkably composed. The community fund, now swelled by donations from sympathetic strangers and even a few anonymous corporate whistleblowers, had given her a sense of empowerment. Michael, though still working tirelessly, looked less strained. They had the resources now to fight this to the end. "They're starting grand jury proceedings next month, Mom," Michael informed her one evening, his voice grim. "They're building a case for criminal indictment, not just against Elias Thorne, but against key figures at Pinnacle. Julian Thorne is squarely in their sights." "Good," Eleanor said, a quiet satisfaction in her voice. "He deserves it." But Pinnacle wasn't done. Stripped of his formal power, Julian Thorne, desperate to save himself, resorted to more insidious tactics. He couldn't legally touch Eleanor or Michael directly, but he knew how to exert pressure. Frank Miller, their private investigator, noticed it first. Subtle things. His phone calls were increasingly plagued by strange static and disconnections. His office, a small, unassuming space above a laundromat, was briefly broken into. Nothing. "Stolen, but papers rearranged, as if someone was searching for something." "They're trying to intimidate me," Frank reported to Michael over a secure line. "They're digging into my past, trying to find anything they can use to discredit me, and I'm pretty sure they've tapped my phone." "Can you prove it?" Michael asked, a chill running down his spine. "Not yet, but it feels like Thorne is operating off-book now, using his old network, trying to create chaos." Eleanor, too, felt the subtle shift. A few local news stories, suddenly less sympathetic, began to appear, hinting at unrevealed motivations. Behind her lawsuit, suggesting she was being manipulated by opportunistic lawyers or had hidden agendas. Anonymous comments on online forums, clearly bot-generated, attacked her character, calling her greedy and selfish. It was a smear campaign, crude but effective in planting seeds of doubt. Then came the late-night calls, unlisted numbers, silent on the other end, or sometimes just heavy breathing before hanging up. Eleanor, though unnerved, refused to change her number. She refused to show fear. One particularly unsettling evening, she found a dead rose, identical to the ones in her garden laid on her doorstep. It was a single, perfect bloom, severed from its stem, placed carefully on her welcome mat. A chilling message. Her prize-winning roses, a symbol of her quiet strength and her late husband's love, were being targeted. "This is getting personal, Michael," Eleanor said, holding the withered rose, her voice tight with suppressed anger. "They're trying to scare me." Michael's jaw tightened. "They're desperate, Mom. It means we're hurting them." He escalated their security, installing cameras around Eleanor's property and advising her to be vigilant. Julian Thorne, meanwhile, was fighting for his life. In a desperate attempt to regain favor with the board and deflect blame, he made a calculated, treacherous move. He approached Mr. Sterling, the chairman, with a proposal. "Sir," Julian said, his voice laced with false sincerity, "I believe I can offer a solution. The DA is focusing on the entire Willow Creek project, but the core of their case is Elias Thorne and his fraudulent reports. If we can demonstrate that Elias Thorne acted rogue and that a single mid-level executive, perhaps someone who oversaw the early stages of the project and then left the company, was the one who pressured Elias, we can cut the head off the snake." Sterling looked at him, his gaze shrewd. "And who would this mid-level executive be, Julian?" Julian produced a dossier, meticulously compiled, filled with fabricated emails and manipulated performance reviews. "Marcus Vance, sir, the former project manager for the Willow Creek acquisition. He had a history of aggressive tactics, and he was the one who initially brought Elias Thorne into our orbit. He's no longer with the company, so he can't refute it directly." Sterling raised an eyebrow. "Marcus Vance, related to the complainant?" Julian nodded, a subtle smirk playing on his lips. "Eleanor Vance's son, Michael Vance's older brother. It would paint a clear narrative, a disgruntled former employee, driven by personal vendetta against the company, manipulating an independent contractor and then using his family to launch a spurious lawsuit for revenge. The idea was audacious, monstrously cruel, and brilliant in its cold cynicism. It would not only deflect blame from Julian and the board, but also discredit Eleanor and Michael's entire case by painting it as a personal vendetta born from a family dispute. Marcus Vance, a struggling artist who had indeed briefly worked for Pinnacle years ago before leaving in disgust over their cutthroat practices, was the perfect patsy. He had no direct connection to the gravel dumping, no knowledge of the fraud, but his relationship to Eleanor provided the perfect narrative of a family conspiracy. Sterling considered it, the lines on his face deepening. It was a risky play, but it offered a clean way out, a single, expendable fall guy who was conveniently out of the picture. "Prepare the narrative, Julian," Sterling finally said, a chilling gleam in his eyes. "Make sure it's airtight, and make sure our legal team has plausible deniability regarding this new information." Julian Thorne left the meeting with a renewed sense of purpose. He hadn't just saved himself, he had conceived a plan to utterly destroy Eleanor Vance's credibility and turn her family against itself. He envisioned the headlines: "Vance family feud exposed. Lawsuit a revenge plot?" He almost smiled, but Julian's desperation made him reckless. Unbeknownst to him, one of Sterling's longtime administrative assistants, a quiet woman named Carol, had grown increasingly uneasy. with Pinnacle's aggressive tactics. She had seen too many good people crushed, too many ethical lines blurred. When Julian handed her the dossier on Marcus Vance for archival purposes, a thinly veiled instruction to disseminate it, Carol felt a moral line being crossed. This wasn't just corporate maneuvering, it was outright malice against an innocent party, Eleanor Vance. Instead of filing the dossier, Carol made a discreet phone call, not to the DA, not to Michael Vance directly. She called the Willow Creek Gazette. She spoke to the editor-in-chief, a seasoned journalist named Robert Maxwell, known for his integrity. She didn't reveal her identity, but she gave him a coded tip. Look into Pinnacle Development's internal scapegoating, specifically a former project manager named Marcus Vance. Check his employment records and cross-reference them with the dates of Dr. Elias Thorne's original engagement. It's a setup. Maxwell, intrigued, assigned his most tenacious investigative reporter to the tip. They found Marcus Vance, now living a quiet life as a wood sculptor, completely unaware of the storm brewing around him, the reporter. The dawn Eleanor Vance woke to was different. Not just because of the crisp autumn air hinting at the changing seasons, but because of the distinct thud of the Willow Creek Gazette on her porch. Its headline, bold and unforgiving, screamed the truth. Pinnacle attempts to frame widow's son in desperate cover-up. Below it, a damning expose detailed Julian Thorne's malicious attempt to pin the fraud on Marcus Vance, complete with irrefutable evidence of Marcus's non-involvement and the reporter's meticulous debunking of Julian's fabricated dossier. The story spread like wildfire, not just through Willow Creek but across national news wires. Pinnacle Development, already reeling from the previous week's court ruling and the DA's subpoenas, was now facing a public relations catastrophe of unprecedented scale. Their image as a responsible developer shattered, replaced by that of a ruthless, desperate, and utterly corrupt entity willing to sacrifice an innocent man to save its own skin. Mr. Sterling, the chairman, read the article in his penthouse office, the words blurring into a red haze of corporate blood. His previous willingness to consider Julian's plan now tasted like ash. This wasn't just a legal misstep, it was an act of public self-immolation. The board convened in an emergency session, their faces grim, their voices hushed with the weight of impending ruin. Julian Thorne was summoned. He entered the boardroom, a ghost of his former arrogant self, his suit rumpled, his eyes haunted. He saw the verdict in their faces before a single word was spoken. Julian, Mr. Sterling began, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. Your actions have brought this company to the brink. The DA's office has indicated they are pursuing criminal charges against you and Elias Thorne. Furthermore, our investors are initiating a class action lawsuit for deceptive practices and stock manipulation. Pinnacle Development cannot survive with you at the helm, nor can it afford to be associated with your criminal behavior. He paused, letting the words sink in. Effective immediately, Julian. Your employment with Pinnacle Development is terminated. You are to clear out your office under security escort. All company assets provided to you are to be returned. Consider this your final severance. Julian Thorne felt a cold, empty sensation. He had spent his life building this empire, only to see it crumble around him, brought down by his own hubris and fear. There was no argument left, no defense. He simply nodded, a defeated man, and walked out, his once powerful stride replaced by a shuffle. His world, built on deceit, had finally collapsed. The grand jury convened, and based on the overwhelming evidence presented by Chief Prosecutor Sarah Jensen, Dr. Hansen's scientific report, Frank Miller's unearthed financial documents exposing Elias Thorne's direct ties to Pinnacle, and the Willow Creek Gazette's expose on Julian's frame-up attempt, indictments were swiftly handed down. Julian Thorne and Dr. Elias Thorne were formally charged with organized fraud, conspiracy to commit fraud, and criminal vandalism. Pinnacle Development itself faced corporate charges, including racketeering and obstruction of justice. The trial was a sensation. Eleanor Vance, accompanied by a steadfast Michael, sat in the front row every day, a quiet, dignified presence. The community rallied around her, packing the courtroom, their silent support a powerful testament against corporate might. Michael Vance, though still her primary counsel, worked in close cooperation with Sarah Jensen, pooling their resources to present an ironclad case. Dr. Elias Thorne, facing the full weight of the law, buckled first. In a plea deal to reduce his sentence, he confessed to fabricating the geological reports under direct instruction from Julian Thorne, detailing the systematic nature of the fraud and the shell corporations used to hide his payments. His testimony was devastating. Julian Thorne, cornered and abandoned by Pinnacle's now frantic legal team, who were more concerned with salvaging the company than protecting him, tried to paint himself as a mere executive following company, directives, an unwitting pawn in a larger scheme. But the evidence, particularly the Willow Creek Gazette expose detailing his desperate attempt to frame Marcus, was insurmountable. His own malicious actions had sealed his fate. The jury deliberated for less than a day. The verdict was unanimous, guilty on all counts for both Julian Thorne and Dr. Elias Thorne. The courtroom erupted in a wave of gasps and murmurs. Eleanor felt a surge of profound relief, a quiet vindication that settled deep in her bones. Justice, slow but relentless, had been served. Julian Thorne received a substantial prison sentence, a stark fall from grace for the once powerful executive. Dr. Elias Thorne, due to his cooperation, received a lesser sentence but had his professional licenses permanently revoked. Pinnacle Development faced crippling fines, a mandated restructuring to address its corporate malpractices, and the permanent stain on its reputation, effectively ending its reign as a predatory developer. Many of its other dubious projects across the state came under scrutiny, unraveling a wider network of deceit. With the legal battles behind her, Eleanor turned her attention to her backyard. The community fund, now overflowing from local and national donations, covered the full cost of not only removing the gravel but also professionally restoring her pool. Local contractors, moved by her story, offered their services at heavily reduced rates. Weeks later, Eleanor stood beside her pool once more. The gravel was gone, hauled away, replaced by the shimmering sapphire blue water she remembered. It was pristine, inviting, reflecting the sky just as it always had. The deep gouges the rocks had left on the pool's surface, small scars, were a permanent reminder of the battle she had fought, but they were also a testament to her victory. Michael, exhausted but beaming, watched her. "It's done, Mom. It's really done." Eleanor smiled, a genuine, joyful smile that reached her eyes. "Not quite," she said, pulling a small silver whistle from her pocket. She brought it to her lips and blew, a sharp, clear note cutting through the afternoon air. Moments later, a flurry of small feet scampered across the lawn. It was her two grandchildren, Michael's young son and daughter, who had arrived for a surprise visit. They squealed with delight at the sight of the sparkling water as they splashed joyfully in the restored pool, their laughter echoing through the garden. Eleanor watched, her heart full. The gravel had been a symbol of desecration, of a dream buried. But now, the laughter of children, the pristine blue water, and the quiet resilience of a community transformed were symbols of something far more powerful: restoration, justice, and the enduring strength of a woman who refused to be silenced. Her pool was not just a pool again. It was a living testament to an ordinary woman's extraordinary fight, a beacon of hope in a world that often seemed too large and too powerful. The twist was that the very act intended to break her had instead forged her into an unbreakable force. The cycle of karma had completed its turn.